When Michael told me about the plan for today, I was actually very alarmed. It is not often that a plan for a meeting at which I am the principal presenter includes a first responder and a second responder. I could only imagine what they thought I was going to do as I stood up here. When I heard that Michael was leaving the academy, I realized that this country was actually probably losing one of its very finest education researchers and, even more to the point, research managers, but probably gaining one of its finest deans, I predict. And in the great balance of things, I think that's a fair trade for the United States. Standing on the Shoulders of Giants is actually the title that I gave to a paper that was released a few months ago based on the last two chapters of Surpassing Shanghai. And in that paper are presented in very abbreviated form the results of about 23 years worth of international benchmarking by myself and by our staff at NCEE. What I'm going to give you right now is 25 minutes of vastly more abbreviated distillation of those last two chapters. I hope that encourages some of you to read the book. Here we go. Following my presentation of a distillation of our last 23 years of research, I will issue a challenge. I'm just putting you on notice. So the proximate background is as follows. As I said a moment ago, we've been benchmarking the top performing countries for more than 2 decades. In the spring of 2010, a couple of years ago, Arne Duncan asked Secretary General of the OECD if they would produce for the United States a report on the top performing countries and those rising up most quickly, from which the United States might learn something about how to achieve what they have been able to achieve. And he was, by the way, the very first Secretary of Education to have done that. The OECD then turned to us and asked us if we would produce that report for them under their supervision. That report was released, a year ago, December. Following that, we put together Surpassing Shanghai, which is based on that report, but which contains a set of recommendations for the United States, which the OECD did not contain at the request of the United States government. Just a couple of months ago, we started at NCEE something new. It is a web portal, and what it provides access to is a very wide range of information about the top performing countries in the world. That is, top performing in terms of student achievement. And we hope that some of you at least will be interested in it. If you Google ncee.org, it will take you to the Center on International Education Benchmarking and to a growing range of resources about other countries and their education systems. Most of you, I am sure, are familiar with our performance, that is the performance of the United States with respect to education achievement in relation to other students in the world. If you are not, I will share it with you in just a moment. But that is not actually the worst of it. Our status with respect to the degree to which we provide opportunity for the students at the bottom of the distribution is even lower, as I will show you in a moment. And that is not the worst of it. Our status with respect to the cost per student of educating students in our system is even worse. Here are the statistics. This is a display of the scores for the participants in the most recent administration of the Program on International Student Assessment by the OECD. You will see in yellow what the average score was for all of the countries assessed. I should tell you that a number of these countries are not first world countries, they are second world countries, and some are third world countries. And we come out, as you can see by this distribution, about in the middle of the distribution. There are many countries doing much better than the United States. That's our record with respect to education achievement. My second point had to do with equity. What this shows you is the percent of variance in student performance explained by socioeconomic status. That is to say, the degree to which how well kids do in school is a function of the socioeconomic status of their parents. And what you see here is the OECD average way over toward the right, and the United States way below that average. Every country on this chart below the blue dot of the OECD average, that is to say over on the left, is higher than us. That is, it does better than us with respect to this crucial statistic. But that's not the worst of it. This is a display of annual expenditure by educational institutions per students for all services. And way over on the left is the United States. We spend more per capita on our kids here in the United States in elementary and secondary education than any other country in the OECD rankings, save for the tiny principality in the middle of Europe. We're a big spender. So whether you look at student achievement, whether you look at equity, or whether you look at system efficiency, we are in very bad shape. Furthermore, one country after another is surpassing us. I should tell you, by the way, that we are not doing worse than we used to do. We're actually doing a little better. It's not that we are doing worse, it is that these other countries have figured out over the years how to surpass our achievement in each and every one of these domains. Why have we been benchmarking? How does benchmarking relate to the problem I was just describing to you? I'll tell you. Way back in the late 1970s, David Kearns had just become president and chief executive officer and chairman of the Xerox Corporation. Xerox had come from nothing to Fortune 500 in a faster time than any other corporation in the United States. Xerox was at that time the Google of its era. And a few months after David became chairman and CEO, a group of engineers walked into his office. They had just been in Japan, they had spent weeks there, and they told David that they had discovered a little tiny company named Ricoh. Ricoh, they said, had figured out how to make small copiers, taking about half the time to get to market from design that it took at Xerox. They were able to sell their copiers to their customers for less money than it cost Xerox to build a computer before they added on their overhead, their shipping, their profit, and all the rest. And these engineers said to David, I don't care what our stock price is and where we are in the Fortune 500, we're going to be out of business. So you better figure out how to shut this corporation down because there's no way we can compete. And David turned around to them and he said, you know, those guys put on their pants one leg at a time, just the way you do. You get on our airplanes and you go back to Japan and you figure out how they do it. And you figure out how to do it better. And when he did that, he invented a discipline called industrial benchmarking. That's what it is. It isn't about how to copy somebody. It's about how to figure out who the leaders are, how they do what they do, and how to figure out how to do it in your own way better. So, what should the American response be to the problem I described to you? The solution? Industrial benchmarking. If somebody else has figured out how to beat us, not just one somebody else, one after another, don't you think it would make a lot of sense for us to go and figure out how they're doing it and figure out how to do it better? There we are. As we did that over the years, we came to what was for us at least a startling conclusion. With the exception of the state's Common Core State Standards program, the most popular education reform strategies in the United States are not being used by the top performing countries. And the key strategies being used by the top performing countries are not being used in the United States. We are on our own separate little planet. So what are the strategies that we are using that they are not? The left, for a long time, has said more money will solve the problem. That's a hard case to make when you discover that we are spending more than any other country per student already. This country, about 20 years ago, took a detour in national education policy that the public was hardly aware of. We made a whole set of trade-offs favoring class size in the United States, producing smaller class sizes over the years, choosing that over a variety of other strategies that were available to us. Guess what? In most of these countries, class sizes are larger, and in many of them, much larger. It is impossible to make the case, looking at the international data, that we should be investing in reducing class size. These days, the leading strategy is tying teacher pay and retention to scores on standardized student achievement tests. Not one of the top performing countries is doing that. And that is not, by the way, because they are unaware of the possibility of doing that. They have looked at the United States doing it and said, I don't think so. That's not the direction we want to go in. Not one of them is supporting social entrepreneurs to produce disruptive change. They are totally puzzled why we would be interested in doing such a thing. They're trying to improve their system. They're not trying to destroy it. None of them are taking the caps off charter schools. Do you know why? They don't have any charter schools. So what is it that they are doing? I'm going to take you very quickly through 7 main strategies that they are employing. There are more, and you will find them in Surpassing Shanghai. First of all, they are all aggressive international benchmarkers. They are intensely interested in what the other top performing countries are doing, and they never stop benchmarking because every country that is a top performer is desperately trying to get better than they are, and they're changing their system all the time. Once you become a benchmarker, you never stop. The second important point is they are not generally benchmarking. They're benchmarking with respect to a particular goal that they've got. They are focused on the strategies these countries are using to produce widespread acquisition of complex skills, creativity, and innovative capacity. If you talk to them, they won't talk to you much about basic skills. They've gotten way beyond that. They're up to much more complex skills. That's what they're after. Second, they all have very powerful instructional systems. Some of these countries call them by a variety, of names, but the point is basically they have figured out what their core curriculum is going to be for all students, typically through the age of 16. And they decide what subjects those students are going to learn. In most of these countries, there is very little elective choice until kids have mastered the common curriculum. Most of these countries at the high school level, for each course in the curriculum, have worked very hard for a long time creating very high-quality syllabi for the courses that they expect to be taught. They have developed examinations which are keyed not to abstract standards, but to that curriculum and those courses and their design. They are curriculum-based exams. Not one of these countries has an examination which relies primarily on computer-scored multiple-choice tests. The reason for that has to do with what I said a moment ago. Their primary interest is in complex skills, in innovative and creative capacity. They don't think you can measure those things with computer-based multiple-choice tests. They invest a lot more in assessment than we do because they are very clear about what they want to get out of the system. They have curriculum frameworks that go back down to grade 1. They have decided what topics will be taught in each year, in each subject in the curriculum. The subjects, by the way, that they require go way beyond their native language and mathematics to include the sciences, world history, their own nation's history, art, music, and so on. It's a broad, humanistic, if you will, curriculum. The teachers, when you go to a school of education in those countries, what you find is they're teaching the teachers how to teach the national curriculum. Would make sense because that's what the kids are learning in the classrooms. So what you have in these countries is a highly aligned instructional system. Very powerful and very coherent. The Common Core State Standards are a start on what I described. If you were making a ruler 36 inches long, it probably represents about 1.5 inches. When we get it done, it will represent 1.5 inches on that 36-inch yardstick. We are just barely beginning what they have invested years and years and hundreds of millions of dollars in doing. Third, they have a design to get all students to high standards. So do we. But what we have is a slogan. What they have is a design. There's all the difference in the world. In those countries, they ask themselves in a very serious way, if we want to get all students to high standards, what exactly do we have to do to get there? And they lay it out, as an engineer would lay it out. So, for example, excuse me, in their systems, none of these systems now have anything like our local control of school finance. And so in those systems, it's very clear they get more money to kids who are harder to get to high standards than they give to kids who are easier to get to high standards. Because their aim literally is to get all kids to the same high standards. Many of them give their very best teachers to the kids who are hardest to educate. All of them give the hardest to educate kids more teachers than they give to the kids who are easier to educate. Why can't I see the bottom of this? There is no tracking in these systems. Basically, these are systems in which they lay out from grade 1 to grade 10 in our terms, what the kids are supposed to achieve year by year in order to reach the same high standards at the end. They don't hold kids back, and they don't push them ahead. The aim is to get them all in a very demanding trajectory and keep them there. No Child Left Behind was a slogan for us. It's a design criterion for them. This one, of course, has been widely talked about, and for good reason. It is crucially important. A high-quality teaching force. They have very high not moderately higher standards, much higher standards for getting into teacher education than we do here in the United States. In most of these countries, it is as hard to get into a school of education as it is to get into a professional school for the high-status professions, medicine, engineering, architecture. Most of them are moving teacher education from low-status institutions, in effect our formal normal schools, we don't call them that anymore, but that's what they still are, into their research universities. They're making sure that all of their candidates, including future elementary teachers, are deeply versed in the subjects that they teach. At the secondary level, they have to have majored in college in the subject they will teach. At the elementary level, what they typically do is they tell their elementary teachers, you are either going to be a teacher of math and science or you are going to be a teacher of your native language and history, and you have to have at least minored in those subjects. It is, in the United States, it is commonplace for teachers of mathematics in our elementary schools to have never taken a college-level mathematics course. Unthinkable in these countries. It is equally important to them that their teachers master the craft of teaching. So in virtually every one of these countries, in addition to really mastering the subject you're going to teach, you are expected to take at least a full year mastering your craft. There are no alternative routes in any of these countries. There is nothing like Teach for America where you are expected to be a teacher after a few weeks of instruction in teaching. They don't believe that works. There's a good reason for that, actually. It doesn't. Once their students get out of the schools of education, they are typically given to a master teacher in the schools and put under their wing in a year-long apprenticeship. They have a vastly reduced teaching load. Their master teachers give them demonstration lessons. They have these new teachers give demonstration lessons, and they critique them closely. They learn by doing. There are career ladders for people who want to remain in the teaching profession. In most of these countries, at the top of those career ladders, when you get to be a master teacher, you are paid as well or better than the principal in your school. None of this would happen if they didn't pay their teachers well. In most of these countries, beginning teachers are paid what beginning engineers are paid. So it makes it possible to recruit teachers from the same group of people who could otherwise be doctors, lawyers, architects, and engineers. The result of all of this is that the ratio of applicants to acceptances in the schools of education in the countries I'm describing are on the order of 6 to 1, 8 to 1, and 10 to 1. Imagine a school of education in the United States for which that was true. Because they are recruiting people to what they are describing as a profession, they have to make good on the promise. One of the characteristics of a professional is that you have professional autonomy, and that is what you'll find in these countries. Crucially important, in this country, we are constantly waiving our very low standards for teachers in the face of teacher shortages. In these countries, they never waive the standards. Never. Why? Because they don't have teacher shortages. Because they have a built-in surplus of people who are qualified at a very high level to do the work. So that is why in these countries, it makes no sense for them to focus on getting rid of their worst teachers, which is our primary focus. They don't need to. They have schools in the country from one end to the other full of great teachers. Another slogan of ours on which we have yet to make good. By the way, the argument that our schools would be vastly better if only we could reduce the power of our unions or get rid of them altogether is not borne out by the evidence if you look at the top performing countries. Several of the top performing countries have some of the strongest teachers' unions in the world. The data show absolutely no correlation whatever between the strength of the unions in these countries and student performance. But I need to point out that most of the unions in those countries have adopted a professional, not an industrial model of work organization, a point to which I will get in somewhat more detail in just a minute. So here we are. If you look overall at what they are doing in these countries, they are converting teaching from a blue-collar occupation into a true profession, from a tailorized occupation into one of the kind that Peter Drucker described in The Age of Discontinuity, a profession involved in knowledge work. Again, you'll find these slogans in the United States, but you won't find management mechanisms in our schools that reflect them. In the industrial model, the Ford model of 1910, is a high-volume, low-cost, low-quality, high-waste model. The assumption of the managers is that the skill is in the machine, not the workers. The workers are a dime a dozen. They can all do the work. If you drop a few, it's easy to get others. They're treated like interchangeable parts. In a system like that, accountability runs vertically. It runs up to the supervisor. In that system, unions are expected, in our country required by law, to defend their workers irrespective of the quality of the work. Which makes perfect sense because you don't expect the workers to do quality work in a system like that. It's not part of the idea. A professional model is the opposite in almost all important respects. In a professional model, the quality is in the worker. The skill is in the worker. The aim is to turn out consistent high quality. Not low-priced, low quality, but high-priced, high-quality products. You use a professional model when what you're looking for is great discretion in the worker based on very deep knowledge, which the industrial worker was never expected to have. The worker is expected, therefore, to have high skills, not low skills. The primary accountability in a professional model is not to your supervisor, although there is accountability to the supervisor, it's really to your colleagues. The model is a collaborative model, not a model which is based on and assumes conflict. These are utterly different management models. Lastly, and in some ways most importantly, when you visit these countries that are high-performing countries, what you see is effective systems of education. This is the hardest thing for me to convey to people who've lived most of their lives in the United States, because you don't see a system that's not a system until you see a system that is a system. In the United States, it would take me a really long time to get to the bottom of this, but in the United States, if you look at education law for a particular state, it typically occupies a set of volumes which occupy 2.5 to 3 shelves. There's a reason for that. When we make education law or education regulation in the United States, we simply add to what went before. Pile after pile. Same thing happens in schools. In these other countries, something utterly different goes on. They ask themselves, with respect to each innovation, how does it fit with what we're already doing? In those systems, when you look at an individual part of the system, each part supports the next part. That's what an effective system is. We don't have a system in those terms. Many of the parts of our system conflict with the others, and we appear not to care. If I were to name for you the 2 reasons I think our performance is sinking so fast, it is because we don't have effective systems, and we are not going after the best kids in our population to be our teachers. So as we put our education reform plan together in the United States, what kinds of questions are we asking? Read your newspapers. How can we get rid of our worst teachers? How can we get more innovation in our schools? How can we break the back of the education establishment, which has captured the resources of the system for the benefit of the adults, not the students? If those are the questions, here are the answers. If you're really worried about getting rid of the worst teachers, then invent a measurement methodology that will identify them. And once you've identified them, put their names in the newspapers and shame them into leaving. That's one of our leading reform strategies. If you think that the problem is innovation, then use the market to create innovation, because that markets do that. And while you're at it, curtail the power of the teachers' unions, because they are obviously the problem. But the fact of the matter is this. People all over the world, you know this because they do it right here at George Washington University, people all over the world come to visit American schools to get ideas about how to improve their education systems. Now, how can that be true when our performance is what it is relative to theirs? There's an answer to that question. And they describe it, believe me, in the same language. They talk about peaks of performance in the United States. You can find terrific examples of really neat educational ideas and schools here in the United States. It's been possible to do that for the last 100 years, and I predict it will be possible for the next. What we don't have is an effective system. We have little pockets of excellence. That's why they come here. The last thing in the world that we need is more innovation. We have plenty of innovation. We do not lack for ideas. We don't lack for examples of great schools. We got them. Innovation is not our problem. The lack of systems is our problem. The questions being asked in the top performing countries have nothing to do with the questions I just shared with you that are being asked in this country. They're not asking, how do we get rid of the worst? Teachers, that is. They're asking, how do we get a whole teaching force of great teachers? That's their question. They're not asking, how do we create peaks of innovative excellence? They're asking, how do we create systems that will provide world-class education for all students? They're not asking, how do we challenge professional educators? They're asking, how do we build their capacity to do a first-rate job? When our team visits ministries of education in other countries, what we see is an institution whose job it is to hold the education system of the country in trust. It's their job to look at the whole thing and ask themselves, is it functioning at peak performance? And if it isn't, how can we get it to do that? That is not a subversive role in those countries. It's the role they're supposed to play. They have plenty of legitimacy doing it. We don't have any such thing in the United States. Nobody wants the United States government to play that role. The state departments of education are not even within 1 million miles of that role. Nobody can imagine a district operating in that role because you have this thing up above that's regulating it. Nobody plays that role. There is no place where the buck stops in the American education system, and that's why we don't have a system, because it is nobody's responsibility to make sure that we have one. So here I am, ready to issue you a challenge. The U here is George Washington University. The challenge is to make it work right here in our own backyard. The District of Columbia is the one place in the United States which does not fit the picture I just shared with you. In the District of Columbia, the school district is the state. It's all right here. The office of the State Superintendent of Instruction is cheek by jowl with the office of the Superintendent of Schools in this city. Guess what else is in this city? George Washington University, Georgetown University, American University, Howard University, Catholic University. In every other state in the Union, fixing the problems I just talked to you about represents an enormous challenge, because each school district independently sets the salaries for teachers, independently of each other and of the state. Each higher education institution sets the standards for getting into professional training for teachers. And so it goes. Many, many different actors play important roles in figuring out what the elements of the system are. In a situation like that, if a school of education chose to radically raise its standards and nobody did anything about increasing teacher salaries, that institution would go out of business. But here in the District of Columbia, you could get a group of people sitting around a table of 6 and fix this. The dean is laughing, and I understand where the laughter comes from, but in principle that is true, and it's the only state in the Union of which that is true, even in principle. The people sitting around that table could themselves together decide to do what needs to be done about salaries, entry standards into the institutions, changing the curriculum, changing the licensing standard, putting the right kind of curriculum in place. It's all there. That's my challenge to you folks. Thanks very much for listening to me.
And there are a lot of people in the District of Columbia who would be very heartened to learn that the future of reform in the United States could actually take root right here in the nation's capital if we get some of this right. So you want to elaborate on that some more and maybe answer Joan's question?
I'm not sure
Maybe
I know.
not.
I'm not sure. I know of Joan's dedication on these issues in what must be a very long series of disappointments, and how that makes us all feel. We've all been at this a long time. Some of us have been at reform in the District of Columbia for a long time. And yet still, I think it is quite possible to maintain a measure of optimism. It has never been the case in the District of Columbia that the research universities have actually decided to get together with the district to work on the issues that we were talking about. That has never happened. Some of them have done research. There have been any number of NGOs who have tried to do various things in the district, almost never with each other. There has not been a concerted response ever to the problems of this district, not what I would call a systemic response, which is what I was really calling for. I was calling for a systemic response modeled, in effect, on the main strategies used by the most successful nations. I continue to think that's a workable strategy. Most of us, when we propose reform strategies in American education, come up with an idea. We, in effect, postulate that this will work for various reasons. It is really rare that we can come forward and say, this actually has worked on a national scale. Even less can we say, it has not just worked on a national scale. These are the underlying strategies that every damned country among the top 10 performing countries have used. We've never done that. How about trying something we know works? We know works. Let me just say one more word about this. There is a lot of attention these days on Teach for America. A lot of people hold Teach for America up as the model of what this country ought to be doing by way of reform of teacher education and reform of teaching generally. What people tend to forget is that Teach for America supplies less than 1% of all the teachers this country needs every year. And if you look hard, as we have, at the, in effect, the business model of Teach for America, you will see very quickly that that model depends upon it being very small. It's a model that cannot be scaled.
Correct.
It was never, by the way, intended to be scaled. When Wendy put the program together, she did not offer it to the world as a reform of American teacher education and teacher preparation and of teaching in the United States. She had a much more limited vision, and it's very important what she's done. What I'm essentially saying here is imagine what would happen if these 4 universities got together and committed themselves to recruiting and preparing teachers of the quality that we have associated with Teach for America, committed themselves to supplying to the District of Columbia, year in and year out, students who come from Yale, Harvard, Columbia, George Washington University College, right? But seriously. And we're as well prepared as the teachers in Finland and Singapore and so on. We can do this. So we're not talking about GW studying what somebody else is doing. If the central issue, certainly one of the central issues, is the quality of teachers in our schools, you are a major player. We can do this. That's what I'm talking about. It's Teach for America quality teachers, much better actually, because they don't train them in the craft. They throw them in there and hope for the best. Imagine if we did it right.
Questions? We have now, I think, a functioning microphone too.
Is it working?
We do? Yep. Yes. Thanks.
Thank you. Kate Quinn, Educational Policy Institute. I'm having trouble reconciling a couple points that I've heard. Mark, you're talking about these very successful systems, highly paid professional teachers, highly valued professionals in their craft, the higher resources devoted to assessment and true evaluation. And then Colin brought up that in order to have the type of scaffolding we want in proper professional development for our teachers, it is resource heavy. How is it these other systems?
So let me tell you how it's possible to do that. I could not in all good conscience sit before you and say, here's what we need to do, and it's going to cost even more money than we're now spending. Because earlier this evening I told you we're already the top spender, right? I couldn't say that. So let me just share some facts with you. In the United States, as I think many of you in this audience know, more than half the teachers who come out of our teachers' colleges in year 1 are gone from teaching, not just in their school, but from the profession of teaching within 5 years. If you look at the high status professions in the United States, they remain in their profession for something between 2 and 3 times as long as our teachers do after they have left teachers' college. What that tells me is if we were doing this right, we would need somewhere between 1/2 to 1/3 of the number of openings in our teachers' colleges nationwide. Do you have any idea how much money we are spending to prepare 2 to 3 times as many teachers as we actually need? It's an enormous sum of money. Imagine that we were able to capture those savings. A small part of the savings would go a long way toward enabling this dean to hire the finest faculty in the world. Right here, in this college, in an expanded teachers' college. Much of the rest of it, which would be most of it, would go into raising the salaries of the teachers. Because you can't do this without raising their salaries. We are already spending too much money. We are spending it really badly. We're preparing vastly many more teachers than we actually need. We're spending much too little on each one of them. And we're getting a lousy output at enormous cost. Surely we can do better than that.
I just want to add to what Mark said earlier in his presentation, which is that the other big difference in costs is larger class size being the trade-off for higher salaries.
Yes.
And in these other countries, teachers have knowingly, systems have knowingly made these trade-offs so that they understand, and Mark can tell you that there are teachers in this country who in charter schools or teacher-run schools have made that same decision. You know, if we don't insist on 22 children in each classroom and a second teacher at 23, which I just saw in a school in Arlington, then we are able to offer a higher salary to people. And it doesn't have to be a millionaire's salary. It just has to be enough so that those teachers are able to offer their children the same things that their middle-class friends are able to offer to their own. So it's a systemic issue of trade-offs and what we think is important.
True.
Thanks. We have time for about 2 more questions, so let's try to invite visitors. Yes.
I'm Beth Glenn. I'm the National Education Director with NAACP. Thank you for your fantastic work. We've looked at standing on the shoulders of giants, and one of the things that we're particularly concerned about is accelerating learning, as you said, among those students who are coming from the bottom of the distribution. And I hope you would speak to some more specific practices that you observed or that would foster or accelerate social mobility in the educational systems that you were looking at comparing, and particularly if you saw any movement or particular attention toward pre-K and early learning.
Gosh, that's a very large territory, and I'll try to cover it very quickly. First of all, it is certainly true. When you read Surpassing Shanghai, you will come away with a very clear impression. Those countries that really do a good job with young kids are going to do a much better job through the entire system. You can't build a first-class school system on a bed of sand. What happens to the kids from the time that they're first in the womb until they get to first grade makes a great big difference. In most of Asia, most mothers are home most of the time. They're certainly home when their kids come home, and they have culture essentially provides a situation in which kids in Asia are very supported by their mothers and by their families. I say that because in most of those countries there is not a big formal government-run child care system. You have a culture, you have a set of practices in homes which essentially provide the same result. On the other side of the 2 ponds in Europe, what you find is much higher levels of support for young children than here in the United States, in every way. And either way, you're getting a result, both on the other side of the Pacific and on the other side of the Atlantic, much more support for kids than in the United States. The rate of poverty among children is off the charts in the United States compared to any industrialized country. This is an enormous drag on the success of the American education system before the kids open their first schoolhouse door. There is no doubt about that. About 30 years ago, equality of income among wage earners in the United States was greater in the United States than most of the other industrialized countries. Today it is the worst. That has an enormous impact on kids, not just before grade 1, but actually throughout their entire career. So it puts a much greater burden on our system to try to compensate for that problem in our schools than is the case in most other countries. So when you talk about accelerated programs, You don't find accelerated programs in most of these other countries because they don't need them. So we shouldn't look to these other countries for good examples of accelerated programs. You don't find very many of them. What you find is that in the United States, the practice for a very long time in the United States, decade on decade on decade, has been for teachers in kindergarten and first grade to assign kids to different ability groups based on mostly their intuition about whether kids were, quote, fast or slow learners. What the record shows is that by the end of fourth grade, that kid's fate is sealed because the curriculum they've been given, if they've been put in a slow group, has been so unchallenging that even if they are in fact very bright, they're enormously handicapped by the lack of vocabulary that they have acquired. They will never get back up to where they should have been. So what you find in these other countries, by and large, is almost no streaming in compulsory education. You get different pathways above compulsory education, but in most of these countries, there is none in compulsory education. So their understanding of what they are doing as they design their system is that they are, as I was saying when I was at the podium, they look at where the kids are supposed to get to by grade 10. They then work that back grade by grade so they know where they're supposed to get to at the end of each year. They train their teachers to be very, very observant, use a whole range of tools to detect when kids are just beginning to fall off that trajectory, and they get them right back on it. They don't need accelerated learning, they just need a system that enables kids to stay on a very demanding track, and that's what they do.